It was September 19th, 1999, and 48-year-old Susan Fassett just knew in her bones that her own personal day of reckoning was coming. As soon as Susan stepped out of church that morning and away from the tight knot of friends all busy saying goodbye to each other, the too bright smile on her face was instantly replaced by the lines of strain and worry that seemed to get deeper every time she looked in the mirror. There was just no getting around it. Over the last 4 years, Susan had made a terrible mess of her life, and now she and her husband of 24 years would have to pay for their mistakes. The day was coming, or maybe it was already here, when she and Jeff would have to look, together and deeply, into the neglected and now poisoned core of their 24-year-long marriage. As Susan walked, pulled out her car keys, and headed towards her brand new gold Jeep Cherokee, she barely noticed the bright sun glowing through the leaves of the maple and oak trees in the woods beyond the parking lot. When she and Jeff had first moved to the tiny town of Pleasant Valley with its 9,000 residents, Susan had thought it was one of the most beautiful places on earth. And it was, with its rolling hills and acres of cornfields stitched with old colonial-style homes set on nice big lots. Pleasant Valley was one of those places that actually lived up to its name. And for Susan and Jeff, the location was perfect. They could live and raise their family in a safe, quiet, affluent community where everyone knew and watched out for one another. And the city where they both worked, the town of Poughkeepsie, 10 miles to the north, was just a 20-minute commute away. But now, Pleasant Valley, like everything else in Susan's life, felt tainted and claustrophobic, like these beautiful walls were slowly closing in on her. Climbing into her car, Susan's shoulders slumped. The problems in her marriage had probably started a long time ago. Her job as a personnel director at Poughkeepsie Town Hall and Jeff's grueling overnight shift as a lieutenant with the Poughkeepsie Police Department had left them with so little time for one another. And now that their oldest son, Jason, was 20, and their younger son, Christopher, was 17, Susan and Jeff were no longer bound together by all these shared responsibilities of the children's school and sports and social activities. But in the last 5 years, something much worse than two people drifting apart had also happened. Because for Susan, her work, or at least the person she had met through her work, had also led her to break the wedding vows she had made so happily 24 years earlier when she promised to be faithful to her husband no matter what. Even now, after so many years that the affair felt almost as normal as her marriage, when Susan actually thought about what she was doing, she still felt shocked that these were the choices she had made. And when she said it all out loud to herself, "I am cheating on my husband, I am having an affair, Jeff does not deserve this," she knew absolutely that what she was doing was wrong. And yet, she had not stopped. She meant to stop. Every day she meant to stop. But armed with that good intention, telling herself that every meeting and every call with her lover would definitely be the last, the affair had just dragged on. And over time, Susan had told herself that the excitement and attention she got from outside her marriage actually made it possible for her to stay in her marriage. It somehow made up for the lack of emotional connection she felt she had with Jeff, and the fact that she and Jeff worked opposite schedules. She worked days, he worked nights, although that too was Susan's fault. But now, word had gotten around Poughkeepsie Town Hall that Susan was stepping out on Jeff, and worst of all, Jeff himself had recently confronted her affair partner, and despite her lover's denials, and Susan's own denials, her pretend outrage had sounded false and hollow, even to her. Just 10 minutes after driving out of the parking lot of the Pleasant Valley United Methodist Church, Susan had arrived home. As she turned away from her car and started walking through the thick carpet of fallen leaves, she noted how the outside of the cranberry red house that she shared with Jeff looked as neglected and in need of maintenance as their own marriage. A moment later, standing at the front door, Susan steeled herself, arranging her features into an expression that appeared refreshed and relaxed, the way she wanted to feel after going to church. Then she opened the door, put down her coat and purse in the hallway, and then stepped into the living room to say what would sound like a cheery hello to Jeff. But instantly, before they had even exchanged a single word, Susan could feel the tension that hung between them, and even without seeing his face, she could sense Jeff's hurt and distrust. And lately, there had been something else in Jeff's expression too. Something hard and knowing in how Jeff looked at her, the way he turned away from her in mild disgust. Just for a moment, as Susan hovered on the threshold of the room where her husband sat waiting for her, Susan wondered how other people in Pleasant Valley saw her. She knew that from the outside at least, she seemed like the last person who would be having an affair, let alone an affair that had grown as complicated as this one had somehow become. To friends and family, Susan was the quintessential mom, wife, and working woman. She was a college-educated professional who was up early in the morning and busy most nights until she went to bed. An attractive woman with curly white blonde hair, oversized glasses, a tiny but somehow appealing overbite, and a solid build, Susan mostly stood out as someone who was always willing to help other people, whether it was through her various community and church activities or in response to a direct request, even if that request came from a total stranger. In fact, except for her height, Susan was over 6 feet tall, Susan knew there was nothing about her that seemed at all out of the ordinary. At work, she was competent, well-liked, and respected, and outside of work, her daily routines seemed as transparent and predictable as her ready smile and generally upbeat attitude. On Monday nights, she attended a jazzercise class at Pleasant Valley's Jewish Community Center. On Thursday evenings, Susan attended choir practice, and on Sundays, she attended church service and helped fill the worship space with the music she loved. If Susan had any guilty pleasures at all, it was probably her devotion to the daily TV soap opera Days of Our Lives, a melodrama that she made sure to record so she could watch it every night after all her chores were done. And as soon as she hit play, she could lose herself in the stories of beautiful people whose relationships, friendships, families, marriages, and work lives were in a constant state of turmoil, like her own had so recently and secretly become. Even at home, Jeff was the only person who seemed to have any inkling of Susan's affair. Her sons, Jason and Christopher, both knew her as a loving mom who was easy to talk with and confide in, that unusual person who would listen rather than pass judgment. And Susan knew that all those traits that made her approachable and kind seemed to have been handed down to her directly from her own mother, or maybe just learned from both her parents ever since she was a child growing up on a farm 30 miles to the south in the rural town of Pauling. Susan's father, a farmer, and Susan's mother, a schoolteacher, had met in church, and while their first house had just 4 rooms, Susan and her only other sibling, a sister who was 7 years older than Susan, had always enjoyed the love and attention of their parents. And after Susan's older sister had left the farm to go to nursing school and later to settle in Connecticut, Susan also started dreaming of bigger and better things, of becoming a teacher 30 miles and a world away in the big city of nearby Poughkeepsie, population 30,000. So, after graduating from college, Susan had packed her bags, and armed with her ambitions, she had left home and headed south. But instead of becoming a teacher, she landed a job in Poughkeepsie Town Hall, where eventually, as personnel director, she would be responsible for all the activities related to hiring city employees and working out their job descriptions and benefits. And it wasn't long after her arrival in Poughkeepsie that Susan had met her future husband, Jeff Fassett, at a local bar. Like Susan, Jeff was also starting his professional career. Jeff had been born in Poughkeepsie, and after attending military college in Pennsylvania, he had returned to his hometown and joined the Poughkeepsie Police Department. A quiet, generous, and dependable man with a quick laugh, Jeff had immediately been drawn to Susan's bubbly personality, sparkling blue eyes, and a playful streak that made her fun to be around. And when Jeff and Susan, so tall in her wedding dress and heels that she could look squarely into Jeff's eyes, promised to, quote, hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until parted by death, end quote, she had meant every word of those vows. But by late afternoon on that bright Sunday, those early days of her marriage seemed so remote, Susan wondered if they had ever existed at all. Still, when she again walked into the living room, this time to ask Jeff what he would like for dinner, the finality of his simple, harsh statement to her came as a shock. Jeff looked up at Susan. "You're busted," he told her in a quiet voice. Then he turned away before saying, "Go, get out." Susan's smile slipped from her face, but before she could offer any excuses or explanations, Jeff told her that he didn't need her confession to know that she'd been having an affair. He was a cop after all. He'd seen the signs and had his suspicions now for months, maybe even years, but until now he'd never confronted her, and he'd never looked for proof. In fact, he had hoped that if Susan was cheating, she'd get it out of her system and come back to him, and they'd never even have to talk about it. But when that didn't happen, and the rumors at town hall were too loud and persistent to ignore, Jeff had recently attached a recording device to the Facets' home telephone, and sure enough, he'd heard a phone call his wife had made that left no doubt in his mind that she was not just having sex with someone else, but his wife was deeply involved with someone else. For the time being, get out meant that Susan would take what she needed for the next several days from their master bedroom and move into the small apartment once intended for Jeff's elderly mother that Jeff had built in a separate part of the house. That night, Susan lay awake in the narrow, empty bed. As she stared up at the ceiling, she thought about her life with Jeff, about all that they had done and made together, about their 2 children, and about the pleasure that both of them used to feel when they were together. It was as though someone had pulled a blindfold off of her eyes. There was suddenly no question in Susan's mind that even though her marriage was horribly damaged as a result of things she herself had done, it was worth infinitely more to her than continuing her affair. As she laid there, she wondered if there was still hope for her and Jeff. And at around midnight, as the clock clicked over to September 20th, 1999, the 24th anniversary of their marriage, Susan turned on the bedside light, then swung her long legs over the edge of the bed and stood up. Slipping on her glasses and pulling her robe tightly around her, Susan stepped to the bag she had packed that afternoon and began rummaging through her belongings. When she found the things she was looking for, she held both items tightly in her hands for a second or two before sliding them into her pocket. Straightening up, she took a deep breath, then left the little apartment and made her way to the bedroom she had so recently shared with Jeff. Once inside, she stood next to the bed and looked at her husband. "Jeff," she whispered, waking him up from a light and troubled sleep. "Would you consider reconciling?" she asked him. And then Susan reached into her pocket and took out the items she had grabbed a few minutes earlier, a cell phone and a pager she had been using to contact her lover. "Here," Susan told Jeff, handing him the 2 devices. "No more," Susan said. "I promise, it's over." A few days later, the Facets' older son, Jason, walked into their house and saw his mom and dad cuddling together on the couch. He'd known that his parents were considering the possibility of splitting up, so he was visibly surprised. When his parents noticed the strange look on his face, Jeff and Susan smiled. "We decided to stay together and try to work things out," Susan told their son. And over the next month, starting with Susan and Jeff both taking a week off work and spending every minute together, it seemed to the Facets' sons that their parents had in fact fallen back in love. Jeff and Susan had even decided to buy new wedding bands and renew their marriage vows, and both Jeff and Susan had started working together on some badly needed home improvement projects that they had been putting off for years. On Thursday, October 28th, about 5 weeks after Jeff and Susan had made the decision to reconcile, Jeff stopped by his wife's office in Poughkeepsie Town Hall. He had just picked up his new wedding band, and he wanted to show Susan how it looked. Smiling up at Jeff, Susan touched her finger to the bright, unscratched gold and agreed that the new band was perfect. Then she told her husband she'd try to be home a little early that evening so they could have a family dinner together with Jason and Christopher and the boys' girlfriends before Susan had to leave for her 7 p.m. choir practice. Throughout dinner that evening, Jeff kept stealing glances at the new gold band on his ring finger. To him, Susan's breaded chicken and green beans had never tasted so good. Now that the 2 of them had talked things out, everything about his life, from simple meals to putting on his uniform each night and heading to work in the dark, seemed a million times better. Before leaving the house for choir practice, Susan smiled as Jeff gave her a kiss and thanked her for preparing dinner. He told her he'd look forward to seeing her when she got back. Then Susan stepped outside and walked to her car. Climbing inside the Jeep, she made the short drive from her home to the big white Methodist church located at 99 Martin Road. As Susan expected, the small lot next to the church was full. After all, with Thanksgiving and Christmas fast approaching, this was a season of music when every member of the choir showed up for their 90-minute practice. But after parking in the second lot across the street, Susan did not immediately get out of her car and head across Martin Street for the church. Instead, she sat for a moment inside the quiet Jeep and thought about the pager that she had not given to Jeff back on the night of October 19th when he had confronted her about her affair. Now, as she looked up at the simple white steeple and cross lit by the church floodlights, she considered the 5 calls she had made to her lover earlier that day. And all at once, Susan could feel her chest tighten with fear. She knew that there was just so much that any husband could forgive, and there were still things Jeff didn't know, things she could not let him know, things that made it very hard for Susan to do what she absolutely needed to do: end this affair. She thought back to the incident that had happened just as she and her family were finishing dinner that night. Jeff had glanced out the window and thought he had seen someone skulking in the shadows of the driveway. His cop senses always on high alert, he'd stepped out onto the back porch for a closer look, but whoever it was, if in fact there had been anyone there at all, had melted away into the darkness. Susan gave a tiny shake and told herself to stop being ridiculous. Her lover had not been happy when she told him she wanted to end the affair, and he had demanded one more recent sexual encounter. But that was done now, and she wanted to believe that they had parted on good terms and that her lover would not do anything to hurt her or her family. And so, if there really had been a person in the driveway, Susan told herself that it was probably just someone who had gotten lost, and maybe they were thinking about asking for directions but thought better of it. And with that, Susan gathered her purse and coat, left the Jeep locked in the parking lot, and headed to the Pleasant Valley United Methodist Church. An hour and a half later, at 8:36 p.m., Susan was stepping out of the church surrounded by friends, all of them chatting as they groped in pockets and purses for car keys before fanning out in different directions as they headed for the two different parking lots. For just 90 minutes, in the joy of singing, Susan had been able to forget all of her worries and guilt. And now, as she said goodbye to other choir members and made the short walk across Martin Street to her gold Jeep, parked under an overhead light in the far lot, Susan felt a rare sense of inner peace. Humming a few bars of music from the new arrangement the choir would sing this coming Sunday, Susan failed to notice that a car she didn't recognize was parked right alongside her own in the church lot. It certainly did not belong to any of the members of church choir, whose cars had become as familiar as the sound of each member's voice. Instead, without so much as a glance at the car or the person who sat inside, Susan stepped to the driver's side of her Jeep, unlocked the door, and climbed behind the wheel. Closing the car door, Susan put the key in the ignition, turned on the car and headlights, then reached up to her left to pull the seatbelt down across her lap. A moment later, the cold, clear night outside the Pleasant Valley United Methodist Church was shattered by the sound of 6 gunshots, and then the kick of gravel as the car that had been parked next to Susan's peeled out of the church lot and was almost immediately swallowed up by the thin ribbon of traffic along Route 72 out of town. Within moments of the shots, members of the church choir were either pulling out their cell phones or darting back into the church to call 911. At the same time, a few others headed for the far lot where the gunshots had come from, and where at least one person saw an older model light-colored station wagon speeding to the parking lot exit. By the time the first ambulance had arrived at the United Methodist Church, one of Susan's friends was sitting hunched over on the ground next to Susan's car, their arms cradling Susan's head and shoulders. When the first bullet had shattered the driver's side window of the gold Jeep Cherokee, Susan, her seatbelt not yet securely fastened, must have reached instinctively for her car door so she could jump down and try to escape the attack. Instead, when the door opened, Susan had tumbled out, and by the time her friend had reached her, Susan was slumped against the side of her car, her neck dark with blood, but still alive. Even as the ambulance carrying Susan had raced off to St. Francis Hospital in Poughkeepsie, the lead detective in the case was already on his way to the crime scene. Arthur Boyko, a lieutenant with the New York State Police, had been notified of a shooting and possible dead body at the United Methodist Church parking lot in Pleasant Valley. Detective Boyko knew exactly where that church was located. Assigned to the Bureau of Criminal Investigation, he worked with Troop K in a barracks located at the edge of Pleasant Valley, fewer than 5 miles from the church. By the time Detective Boyko arrived at the church, local police had secured the scene with yellow crime scene tape and were doing their best to keep potential witnesses separate from the growing crowd of onlookers. Tall, lean, and commanding with his thin face and military-style haircut, the 34-year-old detective immediately took charge of the situation. And right away, he knew that this investigation would be very, very complicated. Because in the same breath that choir members gave first responders the name of the victim, Susan Fassett, they also told officers that Susan's husband was a cop, a lieutenant with the Poughkeepsie Police Department. Even before forming any first impressions of the crime scene, investigator Boyko knew that most murders and attempted homicides are committed by people close to the victim, and that made Jeff Fassett an immediate person of interest, especially since, as a police officer, Jeff had a gun, a service weapon that had to be secured and tested as soon as possible. At the same time, the detective also needed to make sure that Jeff and his sons were informed of the attack on Susan. And if Susan was still alive, her family deserved the chance to visit her right away at the hospital. The decision about whether to question Jeff as a suspect or just inform him of the attack on Susan and let him go see her was made for the investigator when one of the witnesses to the shooting said that the car that had been parked next to Susan's belonged to Jeff Fassett. Operating on the assumption that Jeff was armed and dangerous and may even try to harm other family members who might be inside the house with him, police immediately organized a Special Weapons and Tactics Team, or SWAT team, to surround the Fassett house and take Jeff and anyone else inside the house into police custody. Meanwhile, back at the crime scene, Detective Boyko had assigned officers to carry out interviews with eyewitnesses, along with Susan's friends, neighbors, and co-workers at Poughkeepsie Town Hall. In making a close survey of the scene and hearing initial eyewitness accounts, the detective had also arrived at several important conclusions. As crime scene techs collected and photographed evidence and dusted for fingerprints, Detective Boyko had decided that this was not some random attack or attempted robbery. No one had taken Susan's personal belongings, including her purse, which were still in plain sight on the front passenger seat, and whoever had attacked Susan must have been lying in wait for her, which suggested that not only was Susan the specific target of the attack, but that her would-be killer knew something about Susan's routines and expected that Susan would be at that church that night for choir practice. But the pattern of gunfire also made it unlikely that this was an execution-style hit. Not only did Susan seem like a very unlikely target for that, first responders had also reported that none of the bullets were clustered around Susan's head like you would expect in an execution-style hit. Instead, her attacker had fired a spray of bullets, including one that had missed its mark completely and instead lodged in the doorframe of Susan's car. By the time police had Jeff, his two sons, and their girlfriends lying face down and handcuffed on the gravel driveway outside of the Fassett home, it was 11 p.m. and Susan had already died of her injuries. And for the next 16 hours, police interrogated Jeff about his wife's murder, even as his sons sat handcuffed to separate desks inside the local police station. All Jeff and the boys had been able to find out during a tense 2-hour standoff with the SWAT team that had surrounded their house was that Susan had been shot at the United Methodist Church. Although Jeff declared his innocence and answered every question in a calm, neutral voice, he had been a cop long enough to know that things looked very bad for him. While Susan was at choir practice, he had left his house and driven to Poughkeepsie to get his paycheck. So not only had an eyewitness ID'd Jeff's car as the one leaving the scene of the crime, Jeff also had no alibi for the time of the murder. And police had discovered that Jeff had a very strong motive for this murder. If Susan thought she had kept her affair a secret from those around her, she was mistaken. In no time, neighbors and co-workers had reported to police that Susan Fassett was having an affair. Not only that, but as Jeff told police, just weeks earlier, he had confronted Susan's affair partner with his suspicions right in the middle of Jeff's office inside the Poughkeepsie Police Department. But throughout that long night of questioning, Jeff never wavered from his absolute insistence that he had nothing to do with his wife's brutal murder. And he also never wavered from telling police that if they wanted to find his wife's killer, they should go talk with the man she'd been seeing outside of their marriage. "You can turn on the hot lights," Jeff told the lie detector expert from the State Bureau of Criminal Investigation. "Beat me with rubber hoses. But when you're all done with me and you get me out of the way, you go see Fred Andress. He did this. He's involved in this." The identity of Susan's affair partner and his possible involvement in her murder sent shockwaves through every level of the investigation, even making its way into the regional offices of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. It also sent shockwaves through Poughkeepsie Town Hall, where Fred Andress had worked, until recently, as the head of the town's water department. Because Fred Andress's name was already widely and publicly linked to serious criminal activity. Back in May of 1999, just 5 months before Susan's murder, Fred had been forced to resign his job as water superintendent after he was caught collecting bribes for a man named William Paroli. the most powerful political operative in the Poughkeepsie Republican Party. And one day after Fred resigned, he pled guilty to corruption charges and struck a deal with the FBI. In exchange for a lesser sentence, Fred had agreed to testify against William Paroli, who was charged with running a widespread shakedown operation of local contractors for the previous 6 years. And not only was Fred Andress a known thief and liar, he was also a well-known womanizer. Despite his bullet-shaped head, small facial features, and Elvis-like pompadour all stacked on top of his 5'7" overweight body, Fred was on his 4th marriage, a fact that did not stop him from regularly soliciting the services of Poughkeepsie area prostitutes. The connection between Fred and Susan, confirmed by Jeff, opened the door to all kinds of new leads in the investigation. If it wasn't Jeff who killed his wife in a jealous rage, was it Fred? Was it Fred's wife? If Fred was involved with multiple women, could one of them have viewed Susan as a rival and decided to kill her? Or did Susan, because of her close association with Fred, know something about the ongoing corruption probe that made her a target of assassination? By 4 a.m. on the morning of October 29th, while Jeff was still being questioned at the Pleasant Valley Police Station, investigator Boyko was sitting across the table from Fred inside Fred's comfortable 3-story home located in a nice part of Poughkeepsie called Hyde Park. And within minutes of talking to Fred, the detective was aware that Fred, despite his less-than-handsome appearance, possessed a certain charm and confidence. He also had an airtight alibi for the evening of Susan's murder. From 7 to 9 p.m. the previous night, Fred and his wife had spent the evening with friends, a retired Poughkeepsie police officer and his wife. The men had spent most of the evening down in Fred's basement building very sophisticated model airplanes, which was a hobby the two friends shared. As for his relationship with Susan, Fred would confirm that he had been having a 4-year-long affair with Susan, and that they had actually known each other for 16 years before that. Fred also confirmed that Susan had wanted to end their affair after her confrontation with her husband Jeff back in mid-September, but Fred insisted that it had been a mutual decision to end the affair. And when the two of them had broken it off back in September, Fred had made a full confession to his own wife, who had been generous enough to forgive him. When asked when he had last seen or had a sexual encounter with Susan, Fred disclosed that he was actually impotent and that the physical part of his relationship with Susan consisted of cuddling and kissing and companionship. According to Fred, the last time he and Susan had actually had sexual intercourse was 1.5 years ago. Although Fred was obviously distressed by the news that Susan was dead, the only subject that seemed to make the disgraced town official nervous was whether the murder could have anything to do with the ongoing corruption probe at Poughkeepsie Town Hall. Fred admitted that now that he was a witness for the FBI, he felt like he could be in danger from local bad guys. And Fred also admitted that it was possible Susan could have been in danger just because of him. Contrary to what Detective Boyko heard, that Susan's affair with Fred seemed to be public knowledge, Fred insisted that he and Susan had kept their relationship a very closely guarded secret. It seemed like a small discrepancy, but one that the investigator knew he would have to follow up on. Meanwhile, detectives also began to collect all of the communication data, telephone, pager, cell phone, and email that belonged to the key figures in the case, including Susan, Fred, and Jeff. With the help of technology experts, investigators hoped to compile a picture of who was where and who was talking to whom in the days and weeks leading up to Susan's murder. The first break in the case came on October 30th, 2 days after Susan's murder. Partial results from Susan's autopsy had revealed traces of semen inside of Susan, meaning she must have had intercourse between 24 and 48 hours before she had died. Hours later, Jeff was brought back to the police station where he told detectives that the last time he and Susan had made love was 4 or 5 days before she was killed. An analysis of the blood sample Jeff gave police, along with the results of a lie detector test he also agreed to take, confirmed Jeff's story. And after seeing pictures of Jeff's car, the woman who had placed his car in the church parking lot on the night of the murder also told police that she actually might have been mistaken. It might have been a different car. While police were still not willing to rule Jeff out as a suspect, they now knew that they had to find the man who had had sex with Susan within 2 days of her murder. Unfortunately, the problem with this new piece of physical evidence was that police simply had no other suspects aside from Jeff against whom they could match the semen sample. So, even though police had ruled Fred Andress out as the murderer, Detective Boyko decided it was still worth following up with him, as well as with Jeff, to see if either man could shed additional light on what was happening in Susan's life or in her past that might provide any clues to her murder. Because Fred had a solid alibi for the time of the murder, and police had no evidence that linked him to the crime, there was no legal way to compel Fred to give them a DNA sample so they could rule him out as the mystery man who last had sex with Susan Fassett. But when Fred declined the investigators' request for such a sample, there was nothing to prevent Investigator Boyko from inviting Fred to have lunch with him in a public place, and then for the detective to collect a DNA sample by pocketing the straw that Fred had used to sip from his cup of water. Besides, after hearing rumors that Fred regularly solicited sex from prostitutes, investigators had to wonder if Fred had been lying when he told them he was unable to have sex. But it wasn't until mid-December, 1.5 months after Susan was gunned down, that Detective Boyko and the Bureau of Criminal Investigation would get the tip they needed to break the murder case wide open. And the story that investigators ultimately pieced together would make Susan's favorite soap opera, Days of Our Lives, look like a happy fairy tale written for kids. Based on what investigators discovered, here is a reconstruction of what happened on the night of Thursday, October 28th, when Susan left the United Methodist Church in Pleasant Valley and hummed her way across the parking lot to her brand new gold Jeep Cherokee. As soon as the killer arrived at the church, they saw that their timing was perfect. Susan's distinctive Jeep was parked in the lot farther away from the church, and there were several empty slots on either side of the Jeep. A moment later, the killer had backed the old Taurus station wagon with the fake license plates into the empty space next to the Jeep. Now, the front passenger seat of the Taurus was directly across from the driver's side of the Jeep. As the killer hoisted their bulky frame from the driver's side into the passenger seat, they put the passenger side seat back all the way so anyone looking at the Taurus would think the car was empty. Reclining in the dark, the killer tried to slow their racing heart. Earlier that evening, the killer had actually gone directly to Susan's house to see if they could get a clean shot at her while she was eating dinner with her family, or if she stepped outside alone onto the back porch. But the killer had barely made it halfway up the driveway before Susan's husband had suddenly come out the back door and begun to make a slow circuit of the house while calling out if anyone was out there. That had been even worse than what had happened 4 days earlier, on Monday, October 25th, when the killer had driven to the Pleasant Valley Jewish Community Center, intending to kill Susan there, but the center had been too crowded, and Susan's car wasn't there, so the killer had just left. But now there was no turning back. It had been made very clear to the killer that Susan was not dead by the end of tonight, that very bad things would happen to the killer's own family. Closing their eyes in the dark, the killer could see the photographs spread out on the kitchen table in front of them. The killer's son, each sibling, each aunt, each stepchild, all pictured alone, all vulnerable to some terrible accident, including murder. It would be a shame if anything happened to them, the person sitting across the table had said in that low monotone that had somehow always sounded so threatening and dangerous. The choice was clear: Susan or the killer's own loved ones. And at 4 p.m. that afternoon, the killer was driving away from their home in the Catskill Mountains, 1 hour south to Pleasant Valley. Along the way, the killer stopped at a local Kmart near the Fassett home and bought shoes, a t-shirt, a black full-face ski mask, and a bottle of pain pills for the headache that now never seemed to go away. A little further on, the killer pulled into a Dunkin' Donuts coffee shop and bought 24 donuts and then crammed them one after the other into their mouth. There had been an added incentive: get rid of Susan, and the killer would not have to pay back that loan, which now totaled over $10,000. Yes, the decision to go directly to Susan's house had been stupid, but there was no harm done. And now the killer was perfectly placed to make the kill and then forget that any of this had ever happened. The reason Susan had to die was so she could never testify in court about the corruption case. But sitting here now, the killer decided that for the person who had set this plot in motion, the real motive here was revenge. A moment later, the killer checked their watch and then reached over to the .45 caliber Ruger on the seat next to them. It was almost time. And sure enough, just after 8:30 p.m., the killer could see the doors of the church open, and in the light that spilled out, the killer had no trouble recognizing Susan's tall figure and white blonde curls. After exchanging goodbyes with other members of the choir, Susan stepped out from the group and started making her way across Martin Street toward the second parking lot. The killer stared at Susan in fascination. They had only been together 5 times, but the killer knew every inch of those long legs and feel of Susan's solid hips, back, chest, arms, and mouth. But aside from knowing Susan's body, the killer felt no connection to the woman they were about to kill. It wasn't like they had ever been in a relationship with one another. A minute later, and Susan had walked to the driver's side of her Jeep, opened the door, and tossed her purse onto the passenger seat. The killer lay back, still reclining, until Susan had climbed into the Jeep and started the engine. Then, sitting up, the killer leveled the gun at Susan and started pulling the trigger. The first shot shattered the window on the driver's side of the Jeep. That same bullet also passed directly through Susan's neck, hitting 2 major arteries. As Susan opened her door and tumbled out of the car, the killer shot 5 more rounds. 4 of those bullets would lodge into Susan's body. The 5th would lodge into the driver's side doorframe of her Jeep. 2 of the shots were fatal. Even as medics would later rush Susan to the hospital, she was already dying, and there was nothing anyone could have done to save her. As soon as the gun was empty, the killer shifted back into the driver's seat and took off out of the church parking lot. On their way home, the killer dropped off the garbage bag containing the gun, gloves, and ski mask at the prearranged location alongside of a nearby road. Then, Susan's sexual partner, a 50-year-old woman named Dawn Silvernail, stopped outside of a convenience store in Hyde Park, Poughkeepsie. Before heading back to her house and husband up in the Catskills, Dawn called her other sexual partner, Fred Andress, on his pager. As soon as the device connected, Dawn carefully typed in the numbers 666, the agreed-upon code that would let Fred know that Susan Fassett, the 3rd member of their sexual threesome, and the woman who had dared to leave him, was now dead. It would turn out that it was Fred who had planned and orchestrated Susan's murder by coercing another one of his lovers to kill Susan. But it wasn't until mid-December that Fred revealed the name of the woman who had actually fired the shots that killed Susan. That was when an analysis of the DNA from Fred's drinking straw confirmed that Fred was the mystery man who had had sex with Susan within 2 days of her murder. By the time Jeff Fassett had confronted his wife back in mid-September with proof that he knew about her affair with Fred Andress, Susan already knew that when it came to Fred, she was in way over her head. What had started as an affair 4 years earlier had become a relationship that Fred used to play out his own sexual fantasies. He made that easier for himself by getting Jeff Fassett moved to an overnight shift so Fred would have better access to Susan. In addition to Fred's relationship with Susan, he had also been involved with a woman named Dawn Silvernail. The two had first met back in 1977 over Citizens Band Radio, where Fred went by the name Neptune and Dawn went by the name Footloose. After meeting in person a year later, the two began a sexual relationship that would continue on and off for more than 20 years, during which time Fred would marry and divorce multiple times, and Dawn would marry and settle in the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York. Over the years, Fred had loaned Dawn about $15,000, which Dawn started paying back by performing sex acts for Fred, including having sex with Fred's friends and acquaintances. And by the summer of 1999, Fred had developed a taste for watching 2 women have sex with each other and then joining in to make it a threesome. It was then that Fred started recruiting and paying Dawn to have sex with Susan. The encounters would usually take place on the concrete floor of one of Poughkeepsie's several water pumping stations, except for the first encounter, which Fred staged in his own basement and which he videotaped from start to finish. After Susan ended her affair with Fred in mid-September, Susan's family believes that Fred, enraged by the rejection, may have threatened either to harm Susan's family or to reveal the contents of that sex tape unless she continued to see him. Once Fred was confronted in mid-December by investigators who now had proof that Fred had been lying to them all along about his involvement with Susan, Fred tried to save himself by pointing the finger at Dawn and insisting that Susan's death was the result of a lover's quarrel between the two women. But when interrogated by police, Dawn eventually laid out every detail of the murder plot devised by Fred Andress, and handed over to police the gun she had used to kill Susan. And Dawn's story would be backed up by an analysis of phone and pager records belonging to Fred, Dawn, and Susan. The data showed that Dawn had called and talked with Fred several times on the day of Susan's murder, and that Dawn had paged Fred from the convenience store near his home shortly after she had committed the murder. According to Dawn, Fred had insisted that Susan had to die so she could never testify against him in court about his involvement in the Poughkeepsie corruption scandal, except that federal agents insisted that Susan had no involvement in that corruption probe and no information that could affect the case one way or another. But before police could arrest Fred, there would be one more unbelievable twist to this bizarre and tragic crime. On December 30th, 1999, 2 months after Susan's murder, police were inside the Andress house executing a search warrant when they heard a single gunshot up in the attic. Realizing that he would be prosecuted for murder, Fred had attempted suicide by holding a gun to his chin and pulling the trigger. But instead of traveling up into his brain, the bullet glanced off the bone in Fred's jaw, and instead of killing him, it blew away the lower part of his face. Fred would survive the self-inflicted injury, and on February 23, 2001, he was found guilty of second-degree murder and conspiracy in the first degree in the death of Susan Fassett. The two charges would carry a combined prison sentence of 50 years to life. On March 16, 2001, Dawn Silvernail, who had accepted a guilty plea in exchange for testifying against Fred Andress, was sentenced to 18 years to life for killing Susan Fassett. 1 year and 9 months into his prison sentence, at the age of 63, Fred Andress died of an apparent heart attack at the Clinton Correctional Center in New York. Dawn Silvernail was released from prison after serving 16 years. She died 3 years later at the age of 70. Susan's husband, Jeff Fassett, remarried 5 years after Susan's death, and 2 years later retired from the Poughkeepsie Police Department. Jeff would die of cancer in 2018 at the age of 67. On the afternoon of March 2nd, 2000, Kayla St. Pierre could barely keep her eyes open as she sat in class at her elementary school in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Her throat felt scratchy and her limbs felt like lead, and it took all of 10-year-old Kayla's concentration just to understand what her teacher was saying. Kayla had woken up that morning feeling foggy and run down, but she went to school anyway because she hated to miss class. She toughed it out through a pop quiz, then PE class and lunch, but now she was fading fast. Her eyes drooped, and suddenly there was a hand on her shoulder. It was Kayla's teacher gently shaking her awake. The teacher told Kayla that she needed to go see the nurse, and inside, Kayla actually felt really relieved. Kayla stumbled out of class and shuffled down the hall to the nurse's office. She didn't understand how she could be so tired, and when she saw the nurse, she asked if she could just go home and go to bed. The nurse checked Kayla's pulse and took her temperature, then told Kayla she was going to call her mom. Kayla nodded and then curled up on her side on a cot against the wall, and she nodded off. She woke up to the sound of her mom in the hallway talking with the nurse about how Kayla might have the flu. Kayla tried to sit up to hug her mom when she came in the room, but her body felt too heavy. So Kayla's mom helped her to her feet, and then Kayla sort of held on to her mother as they left the school and went out to the family car. As they drove home, Kayla's mom tried to reassure her that everything was going to be fine. At home, Kayla dropped onto the couch and pulled a blanket up to her chin. Her mom turned on cartoons, gave her some aspirin, and went to warm up some soup as Kayla fell asleep again. When Kayla opened her eyes several hours later, she was still on the couch, but the TV was off, and her mother had tucked her in with a fluffy blanket and her favorite pillow. Kayla threw off the blanket so that she could go upstairs to her own bed, but something strange caught her eye. Now that the blanket was off of her, she could see that she had these bright purple spots all over one of her arms. She blinked and looked closer. They were small and dark, and there were dozens of them. As Kayla's eyes adjusted to the darkness, she suddenly noticed that her legs were covered in these purple spots too. Something was obviously wrong with her, and so she tried to yell out for her parents, but only a tiny whisper came out. She could barely make a sound. Then Kayla tried to get off the couch to go find her parents, but her legs were like jelly. She tried to wiggle her toes, but she couldn't. They didn't move. And so Kayla really began to panic as she lay there frozen. Using all her strength, Kayla did finally slide off the couch and onto the carpet, and from there she crawled her way across the room and up the stairs and all the way into her parents' room. Once she was in there, Kayla couldn't stand and she basically couldn't speak, so she just laid there on the floor in her parents' bedroom, banging her fist against their bed frame. Kayla's mom was initially confused about where this banging sound was coming from, but then she looked over the edge of her bed to find her daughter lying there on the floor. Kayla's mom asked Kayla, what are you doing down there? Kayla looked up at her mom, and even though she couldn't say the words, she mouthed the words as clearly as she could that she needed to go to the hospital. Suddenly, Kayla's mom and her dad, who was awake at this point, both realized that their daughter was in great danger, and they dove into action, turning on lights, throwing on clothes, grabbing car keys. Kayla's mom grabbed Kayla's shoes and crouched down and put them on her because Kayla couldn't move at all. And by this point, Kayla was just crying hysterically because she was so scared. She had never been this sick before. And then Kayla felt her dad pick her up, and he carried her down the stairs and put her in the backseat of the car. Then, moments later, Kayla's parents were in the car too, and they were on their way to the hospital. And as they drove, Kayla just hoped that whatever was going on with her was like all the other times she'd been sick, that a doctor would soon figure out what was wrong, they'd give her medicine, and her life would go back to normal. As Kayla's family was racing toward Lawrence General Hospital, Dr. Michelle Harris was filling out the medical chart for a 10-year-old girl named Terralyn who had been brought to the same hospital a couple of hours earlier. Terralyn's symptoms were very serious and very strange. She had a 105-degree fever, she had intense fatigue, and she had a purple spot on her shoulder. Dr. Harris had started her on antibiotics and ordered full blood work. She hoped once the test came back that she'd have a better idea of what was going on with her young patient. Once Dr. Harris was done with the paperwork, she headed to the break room to get a cup of coffee, something she desperately needed when she worked overnight shifts in the emergency room. But before she could take her first sip, a nurse flagged her down. A new patient named Kayla St. Pierre had just arrived in the ER, and Dr. Harris was needed immediately. Dr. Harris thanked the nurse and quickly went to the ER, where she found Kayla in a sweaty, pale heap on a bed. Her parents stood on either side of her, looking terrified and exhausted. Dr. Harris introduced herself and asked Kayla how she was feeling, but Kayla could barely turn her head to look at the doctor. She mumbled that her body hurt and her arms and legs felt weird. Dr. Harris pushed up the sleeves on Kayla's hospital gown to get a better look at her, and when she did this, Dr. Harris did a double take. Her arms were covered in purple splotches, sort of like that one purple dot that was on her other patient's shoulder, Terralyn. Dr. Harris studied the markings on Kayla's arms and her legs more closely and realized that she recognized the condition from medical school. These splotches were a type of blood vessel disorder called purpuric lesions, and they typically appeared in patients whose bodies were fighting off some sort of serious infection. Next, Dr. Harris examined Kayla's hands and feet. They were cold to the touch and darker than the rest of her body, indicating poor blood circulation. Dr. Harris checked Kayla's fingers, wrists, toes, and ankles, but couldn't find a strong pulse anywhere. Dr. Harris had a sinking feeling as she recognized what was happening to this young girl. She took Kayla's parents aside and told them that Kayla's symptoms all pointed to a rare, fast-moving condition called meningococcal meningitis. Kayla's parents did not know what this disease was, so Dr. Harris spelled out the dangers that now lay ahead for Kayla. Meningitis happens when bacteria invades the membrane that protects the spinal cord and the brain. From there, the bacteria can spread into the bloodstream and trigger a runaway infection called sepsis. The purple splotches on Kayla's skin suggested that that was already happening, and if this was left untreated, meningococcal meningitis could be fatal. Dr. Harris told Kayla's parents that the most important next step was to determine how advanced this infection was. To do that, Kayla would need something called a spinal tap, which would allow the doctors to actually see the fluid in her spine. Kayla's parents looked completely overwhelmed by what Dr. Harris had said, and they clung to each other for support. But they both nodded and told the doctor to do whatever she had to save their daughter. Less than an hour later, Dr. Harris delicately pulled back the plunger on a syringe stuck between two bones of Kayla's spine. The girl's spinal fluid began trickling into the syringe and then through a plastic tube on its way to a vial that would be sent to the lab for analysis. And the moment Dr. Harris saw the liquids swirling into the vial, she knew this was a bad case. Kayla's spinal fluid was cloudy, not clear like it was supposed to be. Cloudy cerebrospinal fluid was a sign there was a serious infection in the body, which was exactly what Dr. Harris feared. Dr. Harris handed the vial to a nurse to bring down to the lab, but to be honest, the patient herself had already told the doctor all she needed to know. Kayla was clearly getting weaker and more exhausted, and her fingers and feet were turning even darker. If Dr. Harris didn't act fast, they could lose Kayla in just the next few hours. Dr. Harris glanced out the window and saw there was barely a hint of sunrise out on the horizon. Dr. Harris then told a nurse to bring her antibiotics, blood pressure medication, and an intubation tube, which would pump extra oxygen into Kayla's lungs. Dr. Harris hoped all these together would help get more blood to Kayla's fingers, toes, and organs. But Dr. Harris knew that all these measures alone would not be enough to save Kayla. Dr. Harris took Kayla's parents aside again and told them that she thought it was time for Kayla to be transferred to Boston Children's Hospital, one of the country's leading pediatric medical centers. It was always risky to move patients in such a fragile condition, but given Kayla's rapid decline, Dr. Harris felt like there was no other choice. And the doctor told Kayla's parents some very sobering news. She said they had to move quickly because their daughter very likely only had about a 10% chance of surviving the next 24 hours. When Kayla's mother heard this, she lowered her face in her hands and began to cry. Once Kayla was safely loaded into the ambulance for the ride to Boston, early on the morning of March 3rd, Dr. Harris said goodbye to Kayla and Kayla's parents, and then hurried back to check on her other young patient, Terrellyn. Dr. Harris hoped she was holding up better than Kayla. But as soon as Dr. Harris stepped into the hospital room, she could see that Terrellyn's condition had actually worsened. She looked at the monitor and saw that Terrellyn's heart rate was now much higher than it was before, and her blood pressure had dropped dangerously. Dr. Harris pulled back the neckline of Terrellyn's hospital gown to check that purple spot on her shoulder, and she could see that there were now many more spots. In fact, Terrellyn's entire body was now covered with these alarming bruise-like spots. And so Dr. Harris had no doubt that Terrellyn and Kayla were suffering from the same disease. Dr. Harris felt both worried and confused to have two young patients with meningococcal meningitis on the same night. The entire state of Massachusetts only reports about 75 cases of this disease in the entire year. 2 cases in the same night at the same hospital just could not be a coincidence. Dr. Harris worried that these 2 cases might just be the first in a whole wave of cases because of how easily meningococcal meningitis spreads. Just coughing or sharing a drink or snack, or even just being close to someone carrying the bacteria is enough to spread it. Both girls' parents had told Dr. Harris that their daughters had attended school the day before they got sick, and they both attended the James F. Hennessy Elementary School, which meant any number of students and teachers and staff at the school could now also be infected. And so Dr. Harris realized the time had come to sound the alarm. So she ran to her office and she dialed the number for the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. That same morning, Dr. Charles Dayton was still at home getting dressed when the phone rang. It was one of his assistants at the Department of Public Health. 2 girls had been rushed to Boston Children's Pediatric Intensive Care Unit during the night with life-threatening cases of meningitis. Both girls went to the same school in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and they had both attended school the day before they got sick. The thought of hundreds of kids catching and spreading a potentially fatal disease made Dr. Dayton's heart start to race. But he had faced enough urgent healthcare crises before to know that worrying about them didn't help anybody. He needed to take swift action, especially since school started in just 90 minutes. Dr. Dayton dialed the number for James F. Hennessy Elementary School and asked to speak to the principal. When the principal hopped on the call, Dr. Dayton explained the situation as calmly as he could manage, but the principal was obviously still alarmed to learn that 2 of her students were gravely ill with a contagious condition. The doctor told the principal that he would need to know more about Kayla and Terrellyn. Once he understood how these girls were connected, beyond just going to the same school, he could begin to figure out how they had both contracted the meningococcal meningitis bacteria. Comparing the schedules of the girls would also help determine who they came into contact with, and therefore who was at greater risk of now getting sick. The principal put Dr. Dayton on hold while she went to get the girls' files. Moments later, she came back on the line with surprising news. Kayla and Terrellyn had almost no contact in school. The girls were in different grades, so they had no classes in common, and they also took lunch and recess at different times. Except for possibly passing each other in the hall, it didn't seem like their paths ever crossed during a normal day of school. Dr. Dayton was puzzled. If Kayla and Terrellyn were never together, then how did they both get infected with the same deadly bacteria? The doctor would have to investigate more thoroughly later, but for now, he had more pressing concerns, such as preparing a school for the arrival of 550 students, some of whom might already be carrying a deadly, highly contagious infection. If he had received the news earlier, Dr. Dayton would have considered ordering the school closed, but it was too late for that. It would cause too much chaos. For now, it was best to take normal safety precautions. Dr. Dayton told the principal to have all the bathrooms scoured and disinfected and the water fountains turned off. Then he asked the principal to send his office a master class list so the doctor and his team could try to figure out who had come into closest contact with Kayla and Terrellyn. After Dr. Dayton hung up, he quickly finished getting dressed, then drove to his office at the health department. By the time he got there, his team was already assessing the student list that the principal had sent over, and they had discovered that 82 students and 7 teachers shared classrooms or facilities with either Terrellyn or Kayla. All of them were flagged as potential carriers of meningococcal meningitis. Dr. Dayton told his team to contact the parents of all 82 students and advise them to take their kids to a pediatrician so they could get antibiotics. Then he called the principal back and told her that all 7 teachers who had taught Kayla and Terrellyn needed to be dismissed for the entire day and remain off campus until they'd been tested for meningitis. As word of the meningitis scare trickled out into the school community, Dr. Dayton's phone rang constantly with calls from parents wanting more information. He explained as best as he could, and he reassured them that if their kids took the recommended antibiotics, they'd be fine. But later that afternoon, Dr. Dayton began receiving a different type of call. Local pharmacies were contacting him to warn that they had sold through their entire stock of antibiotics. Parents kept showing up, but there was nothing for the pharmacies to give them. At the crack of dawn the next day, Dr. Dayton's cell phone rang. It was a colleague from the state health department, confirming that the state had just ordered an emergency shipment of antibiotics for Lawrence area pharmacies. A fleet of trucks had just left their warehouses, loaded with drugs to fight off meningitis. Dr. Dayton spent a long day at his desk, confirming deliveries of antibiotics, but also fielding calls from local reporters who had found out about the meningitis cases from parents in the area. Dr. Dayton did his best to spread a message of confidence that the situation was under control, but in reality, he didn't actually know if it was. On the morning of March 5th, so 3 days after Kayla St. Pierre first got sick, Dr. Dayton got a call he'd been dreading. It was a doctor from a nearby hospital calling about a young girl who had been brought to their emergency room in the middle of the night, and her lab reports had just finished processing, and the doctor could now confirm that she had meningococcal meningitis. Then the physician said something else that alarmed Dr. Dayton even more. Although this third girl with meningitis was from Lawrence, Massachusetts, she actually went to a different school than Kayla and Terrellyn. This meant that the meningitis was spreading to a new pool of victims. Dr. Dayton feared what might come next. A third school? A fourth? Then spreading to other towns and maybe even across state lines? Who knew how far this could go? Now it was Sunday, but Dr. Dayton knew he couldn't wait for Monday to take action. So he thanked the doctor, hung up, and then quickly called an emergency weekend meeting at the health department headquarters in Boston, Massachusetts. Once Dr. Dayton got to his office, he pinned a map up showing the 2 schools up on the wall. He paced the room, wondering how Kayla and Terrellyn could have caught the same bacteria despite not sharing any classes or activities. And now there was this third girl from a totally different school who had somehow caught the same bacteria. And so the only explanation that made sense was that these three girls had something in common, just nobody knew what it was yet. Dr. Dayton stared at the schools on the map, lost in thought. Then an idea occurred to him. If the girls hadn't interacted at school, what if they knew each other outside of school? Dr. Dayton told his team to contact the parents of all three girls and find out every extracurricular activity they were involved in. From sports to neighborhood groups to Girl Scouts, Dr. Dayton felt certain there had to be some social thread connecting them, and if they could find it, then they had a chance to contain the outbreak. The next morning, Dr. Dayton was working in his office when he got word that another girl from a city near Lawrence had just been admitted to the hospital with a 104-degree fever. And after taking a spinal tap, a doctor confirmed her diagnosis. She too had meningococcal meningitis. Dr. Dayton slumped in his chair. This was the fourth case in 4 days, with no end in sight. Dr. Dayton desperately needed to find the source of the infection, but every new patient made the puzzle more complicated. The third girl was from a different school than Kayla and Terrellyn, and now today's girl, the fourth girl, was from a different community altogether. Dr. Dayton still felt like all of these girls must be connected somehow. He just needed to figure out what the connection was, and he needed to find it fast. Dr. Dayton called his team together again for another brainstorming meeting. To him, the biggest clue was the fact that all four girls had gotten sick within a very small window of time, which suggested they might have been exposed around roughly the same timeline. He also knew that meningococcal meningitis can take about 2 weeks until victims begin to show symptoms, which meant all these girls were likely exposed roughly 2 weeks earlier. So Dr. Dayton called in his best research assistant and told him to find out what each of the four girls were doing 14 days ago. As his research assistant left to get started, Dr. Dayton's phone rang yet again. It was Kayla's doctor at Boston Children's Hospital, and he had some very upsetting news. The majority of Kayla's fingers and toes had been without a proper blood supply for so long that the tissue inside had died, and it looked like they would have to amputate them. Dr. Dayton thought for a moment about poor Kayla. Less than a week ago, she was probably roller skating and riding her bike like any healthy 10-year-old, and now she was about to become permanently disabled. And the possibility that this might happen to even more kids on his watch made Dr. Dayton almost nauseous. Later that afternoon, there was a knock on Dr. Dayton's office door. His research assistant came in, and to Dr. Dayton's surprise, the assistant looked excited. He said he had just discovered a very strong lead. It turned out all four girls were part of the same local girls' club. Not only that, but exactly 2 weeks ago, 3 of the 4 girls had taken a girls' club field trip together to go see Disney on Ice in New York City. Dr. Dayton felt so excited that he nearly cheered. This had to be where the girls were infected. But he still needed to find out how they had transmitted the bacteria to each other. He stood up, grabbed his car keys, and went to find out. Less than an hour later, Dr. Dayton parked at Boston Children's Hospital and hurried inside. 3 of the 4 girls were there. Kayla's case was the worst, and she had actually just been put into a medically induced coma. Doctors had decided this was her body's only chance to fight back against the disease. Dr. Dayton went to Terrellyn's room and found her lying on her side, flipping through a magazine. She looked pale and weak, but her vitals were stable. Dr. Dayton asked her about the trip to New York. Terrellyn sat up in bed and smiled at the memory. She described how fun the long bus ride there had been, and how exciting it was to cross the bridge into the city, seeing it all lit up at night. Dr. Dayton asked if the girls had brought snacks or drinks along, or if maybe they had stopped at some point to buy them. He assumed the bacteria had likely spread through something the girls had consumed. But Terrellyn shook her head. She said they had been too excited to eat or drink anything. Besides, they hadn't wanted to spill anything on their outfits, since they had dressed up in their favorite clothes. Dr. Dayton was puzzled. If the girls hadn't shared any food or drink, then how did the bacteria spread? Terrellyn told him that as their bus approached Madison Square Garden, where the show was going to take place, that she and the other girls had fixed their hair and touched up their appearance to get ready. When Dr. Dayton asked her to describe exactly what they'd done to get ready, Terrellyn mentioned something that really caught the doctor's attention. He asked a few quick follow-up questions to confirm some details about this thing she had mentioned, but as he scribbled down everything she was saying, he felt like this has to be it. This had to be the source of the sickness. Finally, Dr. Dayton thanked Terrelin and then hurried to the lobby to call his office and tell them that he'd just found the cause of the outbreak. For the next 2 weeks, Dr. Dayton kept waiting for his phone to ring with news of another case, but it never happened. After 14 days with no new cases, Dr. Dayton knew the scare was over. He felt both relieved and exhausted. It would turn out his hunch had been correct. All 4 cases of meningococcal meningitis were due to a single isolated event. Right before the Disney on Ice performance, Terrelin, Kayla, and one of the other girls had shared a tube of sparkly lip gloss to look extra glamorous for the night. And that lip gloss was contaminated with the meningococcal meningitis bacteria. Most likely, the one sick girl who was not on the field trip had also used that same tube of lip gloss sometime shortly before or after. Although Dr. Dayton was grateful to have identified the bacteria's source, he was left with one question unanswered: how the bacteria got on the lip gloss in the first place. Now, Dr. Dayton was never actually able to determine this for certain, but he guessed that someone who did not know they had meningitis must have used that lip gloss at some point. Some people carry the bacteria without ever actually getting sick themselves, even though they can spread the disease. But the bacteria was there, living on that tube of lip gloss, until the fateful day it was passed around before Disney on Ice. 3 of the girls would make full recoveries, but unfortunately Kayla would lose both her legs, 8 of her fingers, and all function in her kidneys. She underwent 50 operations and was bedridden in multiple hospitals for 11 months. But thanks to a successful kidney transplant, Kayla's body did finally begin healing, and today she actually works with the National Meningitis Association, helping educate others about the dangers of the disease that took so much from her.
In 2010, Kayla was a senior at the University of California, Santa Barbara, a big party school. And one Friday evening, Kayla and her friends were at a big party, and Kayla was having a great time, but she was starting to feel really tired. And so she asked her friends if maybe they wanted to leave early, but none of them did. And so Kayla left on her own. Luckily, her house was just down the road, and so she was at her front door in a matter of minutes. That night, her 2 roommates, who were also college seniors, had decided to stay in and just have a nice night with a couple of friends having some wine. And so when Kayla walked inside, she happened to turn to the right, and she looked on the closest wall where there was a sofa, and she saw there was a guy laying there with a blanket up to his chin, and his eyes were wide open. She didn't recognize him, but he was staring at her, and she figured, oh, he must be a friend of her roommates. But as she walked across the room, she kind of glanced back at him, and he had pulled the covers down slightly, and he had lifted his head up, and he was staring at her kind of menacingly. And so Kayla got a really bad vibe from this guy and just kind of hustled into her room, shut the door behind her, and locked it, something she never did. And a few minutes later, she was in her bed and she was passed out. A couple of hours later, she woke up to what sounded like tapping on wood. And so she sat up in her bed and she's kind of looking around. She had a couple drinks the night before and she's half asleep, so she's a bit disoriented. But finally, when she gets her bearings, she realizes this tapping sound is the sound of someone drumming their fingers on the outside of her door. And so she's looking at her door, wondering who would be doing that. And then all of a sudden, the drumming stops and it's replaced by the sound of this person scratching on the outside of the door. And so now Kayla's thinking, okay, is this guy who was out on that couch, is he playing a joke on me? And so she's sitting there wondering if she should just go over there and open the door and tell him to stop. But before she gets out of her bed, the scratching gets louder and louder and louder until it's so loud that it's kind of menacing. And so Kayla decides she's not going to go out there. And so instead, she pulls out her phone and she texts her roommate and says, hey, can you please come out in the living room and take care of your friend who's harassing me? But she doesn't get a response from that roommate, and the scratching is just still loud as ever. And so she texts her other roommate the same message, come out and take care of your buddy here. But again, she doesn't get a response. And now the scratching on the door has stopped and it's been replaced by jiggling of her doorknob. And so now Kayla is just mad because this is obviously a prank and it's a dumb prank. And so she yells out, hey, stop! But it doesn't do anything. And so now Kayla's like, okay, I gotta call my roommates, wake them up, they'll come out and they'll handle it. And so she calls one of her roommates, and they do pick up this time. And Kayla angrily tells them, hey, come out into the living room and tell your friend to knock it off. He's totally harassing me. And her roommate was confused. She's trying to make sense of what Kayla's saying, and she says, Kayla, what are you talking about? What friend are you talking about? And Kayla says, the guy sleeping on the couch, the guy in our living room sleeping on the couch. And her roommate said, Kayla, we didn't have anybody over last night. Is somebody out there? You need to call the police. Kayla's adrenaline surged, and she very calmly told her roommate, lock your door immediately. And right then she noticed the jiggling of her doorknob and the scratching, and it all stopped. And Kayla's wondering, where did this guy go? And then after a couple of seconds, she heard extremely loud banging coming from across the house where her two roommates shared a room. And it was the sound of this guy trying to smash down their door. And so Kayla's screaming, her roommates are screaming. Kayla manages to dial up 911, and before long there are sirens outside, and Kayla hears the sound of this guy run across the house, and she hears the sliding door open and shut. The police come inside, they search the property, and there's no sign of this guy, and so Kayla and the roommates come outside. They talk to the police, and the police bring them over to their side door, and they show them on the outside there was all sorts of scratch marks all over the doorknob and right around the latch. And they said it looks like he was able to jimmy his way into your house through this door. And so then they asked the girls to give their statement about what happened, and they started with Kayla. They went over to her bedroom door so she could demonstrate what happened, and that's when they noticed there were all these scratch marks and gouge marks all over the outside of her bedroom door, and all over the doorknob, and all over the latch. And on the ground was a pair of scissors and a knife. And the police told Kayla that it looks like he used those scissors and that knife to open up the side door, and he was trying to use those tools again to open up her door, but for whatever reason, he just couldn't do it. They told Kayla that most likely when she went in the front door, she caught this guy off guard. Maybe he was trying to rob the place, maybe he had just broken in, but either way, Kayla got in and ruined his plans. And so he leapt onto that sofa, the one against that inner wall, to kind of tuck himself away in hopes that maybe Kayla wouldn't look over and see him. And they told her that most likely when she made eye contact with him, she became a witness and therefore a target of opportunity. And had she not locked her door, who knows what would have happened. In 2004, 16-year-old Misty Tasker was a typical American teenager living in Live Oak, Florida, which is a small rural town right in the middle of the state. One Saturday evening in January, she and her mother attended a church service. Afterwards, they hopped in her mother's truck and they got on the country highway and began making their way home. Their house was just 20 minutes down this highway. It was a straight shot. And this highway was pretty desolate. There were no street lights. It was actually a dirt road despite being a highway. And it was just thick forest on both sides of the road the entire way. There were no buildings or houses between the church and their neighborhood. Misty's mother was already a very anxious driver who would keep both hands on the wheel. She would sit up and kind of hunch over the wheel and keep her eyes intently focused on the road, but at night her driving anxiety would shoot through the roof because she had really bad eyesight. And so she would go to great lengths to not drive at night to avoid that high level of anxiety. But the church service they had just come from had run a little bit long, and so now Misty's mother is driving with the sun starting to set, and she's going as fast as she can to try to get home before it gets too dark. And so as they're bombing down this road at about 55 miles an hour, despite it being about a 40-mile-per-hour zone, Misty, who's in the passenger seat, just happens to look over at her mother for no particular reason. And as she's looking at her, she notices out her mother's window, it looks like there's a little girl sitting on the side of the road. What's a child doing out here in the middle of nowhere? She says to her mom, I think I just saw a little girl. And Misty's mother, who's high up on the wheel, she did not hear Misty the first time. She's just focused on driving and trying to get home. And so Misty says again, I think I just saw a little girl. We need to go back. I don't know what she's doing, but I feel like we need to go back and make sure she's okay. And so Misty's mom looks over at her and she's not prepared to turn the car around. That means staying out later, and it means she's gonna be driving in even darker conditions. And so she's like, did you really see someone? Because we gotta get home. And Misty's like, Mom, I'm pretty sure I saw a little girl. We have to go back. And so finally, Misty's mother, she's very annoyed, but she stops the car, she does a 3-point turn, and she begins driving back up the road where they came from towards this girl. Now, they had only made it about a half mile from where Misty believed she had seen this girl. And so pretty quickly, they slowed down because Misty said, I think she's in this area, and they both began scanning the right side of the road because that's where she's gonna be now that they've turned around. Now, it was starting to get very dark outside, but there was enough light and they had headlights. They were pretty confident they'd be able to spot this girl. And so as they're slow rolling down the road, they both see this girl a little ways up on the right-hand side. Her back was to the road. She had her knees tucked up to her chest and she was rocking back and forth. Misty's mother made a comment that it was a little bit surprising that this girl was out here. I mean, there's really nothing around here. There's no houses, there's no buildings, there's no trails to be walking in this forest on either side. It was just kind of thick forest. And so she just thought it was very strange that this girl would even be out here, especially because there's not any traffic on this road. And so Misty's mother began slowly rolling up to her, and she told her daughter that instead of just stopping right away, let's just drive past her and get a look at her, and then we'll turn around and see if she needs any help. And so as they got right up next to her, they realized she was not a little girl. She was a young teenager, but she was not a young child. And as they drove right past her, they would expect her to turn around and acknowledge the car creeping up on her, considering there's no other traffic in the area and you're just some person sitting on the side of the road. You should definitely turn around and see what's behind you. But the girl did not acknowledge them. She just continued to have her knees up to her chest and rocked back and forth. And so Misty and her mother are a little bit freaked out by this, but they drive past her about 50 meters. Misty's mother does a 3-point turn, and when they're looking back down the road where the girl should now be on their left-hand side, they're oriented back towards their house now, she wasn't there anymore. But there were no street lights. It was now almost completely pitch dark outside, and so all they had was the headlights. And so Misty told her mom, drive up a little ways. Maybe the girl stood up and moved and we just can't see her because she's not in the headlights. And so Misty's mom began driving down the road and kind of turning slightly towards the left to shine the light more to the left, but there was no sign of this girl. For good measure, they turned right slightly to shine the lights more to the right-hand side of the road, but there was no sign of this girl. And so Misty and her mother just slow rolled back down the road, kind of keeping their eye out on both sides. But after traveling for several minutes, going about 5-10 miles an hour and seeing no sign of this girl, they decided that, well, she must have just gone back into the woods and gone back to wherever it was she came from. And so Misty's mom began picking up speed, and before long they had gone maybe 2 or 3 miles away from where they had seen this girl, and they were coming up to this 4-way intersection with stop signs all around. And as they were getting close, Misty's mother gasped because on the other side of the intersection, on the right-hand side, was this girl sitting on the side of the road. She's got her back to the road, her knees are up, and she's rocking back and forth. And so Misty's mother pulls up the stop sign and then just sits there. And both women are just stunned at what they're looking at. They had just seen her 2-3 miles back down the road. It wasn't possible for her to get all the way up here. And so Misty's mother looks at her daughter and says, do you think it's a different girl? And Misty's like, no, that's the same girl. And so they just sat there for a minute until Misty started to panic. And she said to her mom, don't stop. I got a bad feeling about this girl. I don't know what's going on, but you can't stop next to this girl. But Misty's mom, she was definitely weirded out by this situation, no doubt. But she didn't feel good about abandoning this girl in the middle of the night on the side of the highway. And so even though she felt a little bit hesitant herself, she told Misty, we have to at least drive past her and ask if she's okay. That's the least we can do. And Misty was not having it. She said, Mom, do not stop. I got a bad feeling about this. Don't stop near this girl. But Misty's mom let up off the brake and began slow rolling past this intersection. And now at this point, Misty is just absolutely terrified. And so she takes her seatbelt off and she goes down into the footwell right in front of her seat, and she closes her eyes and covers her ears, and she just continues to beg her mother to just please keep going, don't stop. But her mother just continues on until she stops right next to this girl who's still just sitting on the side of the road with her back to the road. She's got her knees up, she's rocking back and forth. She's not acknowledging Misty or her mother. And so Misty's mother turns to her daughter and says, please roll down your window. And Misty refuses. She's still down in the footwell, still in the fetal position. She's crying and she's still begging her mother to please just go home. And so Misty's mother, frustrated, reaches across the passenger seat and grabs the knob to roll down the window manually. So she rolls the window down, and Misty, who's down in the footwell, all she remembers is sitting there covering up her ears, and she's crying, and she opens her eyes and she's looking up towards her mom, who's reaching over the seat, and her mom yells out to this girl. And Misty remembers looking at her mom, who suddenly recoils in horror and screams, and then they take off like crazy, flying down the road. Misty jumps out of the footwell, and she's looking at her mom, and she's like, what's happening? What just happened? What did you see? And her mom's got her hand over her mouth, and she's speeding down the road, and she's crying now, and she's looking at Misty, and she just doesn't have the words to describe what she just saw. And so Misty's asking her mom, what did you see? What happened? And finally, her mother just said, she didn't have a face. She didn't have a face. It was hollow. There was nothing on her face when she looked at me. And so Misty screams and she's crying and her mom is crying and they speed home. They're home just a couple of minutes later and they run inside, practically falling over each other to get in the house. And as soon as they get inside, Misty's mom calls 911 and she didn't even know how to describe what she just saw. But she knew it was too embarrassing to try to describe it as some girl without a face sitting by the highway. And so she just told the police that they had seen a girl they think needs help. And so the police, they went out and they searched that entire stretch of highway. They looked for any sign of anybody out there, but there wasn't. There was never any trace of that girl. In 2016, a 25-year-old Wall Street banker named Matt was camping near Mount Rainier in Washington state. His job was so hectic that in the rare times he got a chance to, he would disappear into the wilderness for a few days to clear his head. Despite living in one of the biggest cities in the world, Matt was actually a very competent outdoorsman. And so for this trip, he decided he would stay way off any trail, deep in the backcountry in random locations. On the first night, he found a nice clearing in the trees, and so he set up his campsite there. He ate some food over his fire, he pitched his tent, climbed inside, and within a few minutes, he was fast asleep. Several hours later, Matt woke up to some strange sounds coming from outside of his tent. It sounded like a couple of animals or maybe one animal moving around right outside. And so after a while of just hearing this constant sound, he rolled over and he barely unzipped his tent flap just to look out and see if he could see whatever animal it was. And what he saw shocked him. There was a man sitting in front of his fire pit. There was no fire in his fire pit. And the guy was just sitting there with his hands on his knees, looking straight down. And periodically he would just kick his feet in the ashes of the fire pit. And Matt didn't even know what to do, so he's just looking at him through this little tiny gap in his tent. And this man all of a sudden looks up directly at Matt and makes eye contact with him. And the guy's eyes go wide and he stands up, turns around and runs away from Matt's campsite. Matt has no idea how to react to this. And so he just quickly unzips his tent, jumps outside and shines his light into the forest looking for this guy. He's thinking to himself, who is this guy? I am in the middle of nowhere in the backcountry of Washington state. How long was he sitting outside there for? What does he want? And so as Matt is trying to make sense of this totally weird thing, he's thinking, okay, I'm going to look out and I'm going to see his flashlight somewhere, or I'm going to see his campsite. You know, maybe he's set up nearby, and he's looking around into the total darkness. He's looking through all the trees. Any light source anywhere out there he would see. And there's not one. There's no fire. There's no flashlight. There is nothing. And so eventually Matt goes back inside of his tent, he zips it up, and he's just left kind of dumbfounded. He can't understand how some person was just sitting outside of his tent for no apparent reason and then vanished into the forest without even turning on a flashlight. And so after a very restless night, finally the sun came up again and Matt was very relieved. He stepped outside, and after a little bit of time now from this strange incident, Matt started to tell himself that all that was is some guy happened to set up his campsite nearby. It is possible, albeit rare because we're in the backcountry, and maybe he was just intoxicated and he wandered over here and, you know, stranger things have happened, so that's probably all it was. And so Matt felt like there was nothing to worry about. He packed up his campsite and he began hiking into the forest. Matt didn't have a planned route. Instead, he had a map and a compass, and he began just kind of wandering in the forest, kind of exploring wherever he wanted to go. And over the next 2 days, he covered at least 10, maybe 15 miles in kind of random zigzag directions. He found a nice clearing and he set up another campsite. That night, he set up a fire and he was eating some food near his fire. And then as he's sitting there, he hears rustling coming from behind him. And he's pretty sure it's an animal, so he turns around and he doesn't see anything. And he goes back to eating his food. And then a little while later, he hears some more rustling behind him. And this time, he can't really just write it off. Clearly, there is something behind him that's moving around. And so he stood up, turned around, and remained motionless and just listened, expecting to see maybe a deer come out of the woods. But instead, he hears a man's voice come out of the darkness that says,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
And Matt's heart starts racing. He knows that even though he can't see him, it has to be the same guy he saw 2 days ago. Because they are in the middle of nowhere. He hasn't seen any other hikers or campers or anyone. And clearly this guy has the ability to sneak up on him. And so he's thinking, what does this guy want? I just spent the past 2 days hiking in random directions for 15 miles, and he must have followed me. And so Matt, not knowing what else to do, just says, "I don't know where Bell's Canyon is." And then there's silence. And Matt, one part of him is thinking, I hope this guy does not come into the light. I hope he just goes away. The other part of him is thinking, well, maybe this is a different person that is lost and they're looking for this place called Bell's Canyon and they'll come into the light. It'll be a big relief. I'll send them on their merry way and everything will be fine. But as Matt is having this wishful thinking, the voice from the shadows does not come any closer, but instead asks the same question a bit more forcefully this time.
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
This time, Matt did not respond. Now he was scared. This is not some friendly hiker looking for directions. There's something wrong. And so Matt, knowing he's all alone out here, he knew he had to do something to try to take control of this situation. And so he took a deep breath, he reached down and grabbed his flashlight, and in one swift motion, he lifted his light up and shined it in the direction of this guy's voice. And what he saw was this guy from 2 days ago looking out from behind a tree right in Matt's direction. He was hiding from him. And when the light hit him, the man barked at Matt to aim it away. And Matt kind of instinctively lowered his light, but now he was too scared to raise it again, and now he knows it's the same guy. This guy has been following me for 2 days. And so for several minutes, Matt just stood there absolutely terrified, and this guy, he just stayed out there. Matt didn't hear him move. It was just a complete standstill. And then the silence was broken yet again by this voice, except somehow he had moved even closer to Matt. And when he came through asking the same question,
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
His voice was so close to Matt that Matt got scared and raised his light up, and the man was standing just a few feet away from him. And this time, the man's eyes got wide like they did the first time they saw Matt, and he turned around and he ran into the forest again. Matt, not knowing any better, just began running after him, but he only ran for about 30 seconds before he realized the terrain out here is so rough. He's gonna fall, get hurt, he's gonna get lost, and this guy's already long gone. He somehow managed to run immediately so far away. And so Matt just goes back to his campsite and he's thinking to himself, what do I do? I have no cell phone service. I'm at least 3 days away from my car, and I'm in the middle of nowhere. No one even knows where I am because I didn't chart a course. I didn't tell anyone where I was going to be. And so Matt just grabbed his knife and stood in the middle of the campsite, and for hours and hours, he just kept looking around, expecting this guy to just show up again or start speaking to him from somewhere out in the darkness. It was absolutely horrifying. Finally, by about 3 a.m, Matt was so tired that he had to go to sleep. He hadn't heard this guy again. He didn't see him again. And he figured, I need a little bit of sleep because tomorrow he's going to pack up his campsite and begin this epic journey back to his car. And so he climbed in his tent and he had a very restless next couple of hours. And then the sun came up. Matt jumped out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and began practically running in the direction of his car. All day as he was hiking, Matt kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see this guy, because clearly he had followed him for multiple days, over 15 miles, and so the likelihood that he's still following him was really high. And so all day, Matt just felt like he was being watched, he was totally terrified, and then the sun started to go down, and Matt knew he would have to camp out again. And so he found a clearing in the trees, he set up his campsite, and he was so tired from running basically all day and being so mentally exhausted from this experience that he just got in his tent and fell asleep very quickly. But several hours later, he woke up to the sound of somebody walking around his tent, and he knew it had to be this guy. He's still in the middle of nowhere. He's not even close to the parking lot yet. And so this guy is still following him. And so Matt sat up in his tent, he clutched his knife, and for hours and hours and hours, all night, this guy just walked around his campsite. And then around 4 or 5 in the morning, he scampered off. When the sun finally came up, Matt leapt out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and literally just began running in the direction of his car, hoping that maybe he could get there before needing to camp out one more night. And so all day as he moved, he's looking over his shoulder, knowing this guy is following him. At this point, it's not even a question. He's somewhere in the forest, but he could never see him. And unfortunately, as the sun was setting, he knew he was not going to be able to make it to his car. He was just too far away. And so at some point when it got too dark to keep moving, he had to find a clearing and set up his tent again. And so once his tent was set up, he just climbed inside, grabbed his knife, and sat there, knowing this guy was somewhere out there. And so Matt climbed inside of his tent, he zipped it up behind him, he grabbed his knife, and he sat there, expecting to hear this guy come walking around. But after several hours, he didn't hear him. And Matt started to wonder, maybe this guy has left me alone, finally. Maybe he's not following me anymore. And so Matt, who was totally exhausted, laid down to go to sleep. And then as he's laying there from somewhere out in the woods,
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
Matt immediately sat up. His heart began racing so fast that he actually was concerned he might have a heart attack. And he didn't know what to do. He didn't know what to say, so he just sat there holding his knife. And then this guy began running past his campsite, making animal sounds. And he would stop periodically and moan and grunt, and he'd kick up leaves, and then he'd run past his campsite again, over and over and over again, until the sun finally came up and this guy scampered off back into the woods. Matt didn't waste any time. He leapt out of his tent, packed his stuff up, and ran all the way back to his car. When he finally got inside of his car, shut the door, and locked it, he cried tears of joy. He was so unbelievably relieved. And he peeled out of the parking lot. He got to a nearby hotel. He finally got cell phone reception, and he considered calling the police about this guy, but he thought, what am I going to tell them? He didn't commit a crime. He was just terrifying. And so he decided not to call the police. He finally flew back to New York, and he just had to accept that there was some strange guy out in the wilderness of Washington state who was able to hunt him over 3 days and 30 miles in rugged terrain without the use of a flashlight, without any gear, and all he ever said to Matt was,
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
So that's gonna do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's
In 2018, James and Brittany Campbell jetted off to the very famous Little Vegas Chapel, which is located just off the Las Vegas, Nevada Strip, and they got married by a man dressed up as Elvis Presley while the couple stood in front of a pink Cadillac. While their wedding was certainly not traditional by Western standards, it somehow seemed fitting for the newlyweds. After all, they were not a traditional couple. Brittany, who was 36 years old, was extremely energetic and outgoing and bubbly, and she even referred to herself as being a little crazy. As for James, who was 35 years old, he was reserved and quiet and kind of analytical and would rarely act on impulse. And on top of these two just being complete and total polar opposites, they had actually dated previously back in high school, and it had not worked out. They had broken up and gone their separate ways, not expecting to see each other again. But nearly 2 decades later, they randomly reconnected, and this time they had something major in common. James was a single father of 2 young boys, and he was desperately looking for a partner to not only share his life with, but someone who would come in and help him raise his kids. As for Brittany, she too was single, and she really wanted to be a mother. And so the timing of their reunion was perfect. A year after the wedding, James, who was serving in the US Navy, was given orders to spend a couple of years working out of a naval base in Hawaii. So the family of 4, along with their little cat named Mr. Franklin, packed up all of their things and left the mainland of the United States, and they landed in Honolulu, which is the capital of Hawaii. The family would move into a modest 2-story home located just a couple of minutes' drive away from the airport. The house was located at the end of a cul-de-sac in this very quiet and safe neighborhood that really didn't look like the type of neighborhood you would expect to see on a beautiful Hawaiian island. It really just kind of looked like typical American suburbs, with all these cookie-cutter 2-story houses right up next to each other on either sides of the road, and out front everyone's got a white picket fence. But for the Campbells, who had never lived in Hawaii before and were used to living on mainland America, it was actually kind of nice to move into this neighborhood and have it look kind of familiar. And so before long, the Campbell family loved their new Hawaii house. That is, until they learned their house had a dark secret. It all started in June of 2019, so not long after the Campbells had moved to Hawaii. Brittany, she had to go into the garage to get something. Now, their garage was attached on the left side of their house if you were looking at their house from the street, and there was a door on the first floor of the house that led into the garage. And so Brittany, she walked across the first floor, she opened that door in the house, she went into the garage, she flipped on the light switch, and what she saw all over the garage made no sense to her. They still had a bunch of moving boxes that they had not unpacked since they'd only been in Hawaii for a matter of weeks. And so all these unopened boxes, they had just kind of stacked up inside of the garage. But when Brittany had turned the lights on and looked into the garage, she saw nearly all of those boxes had been toppled over, and lots of the contents inside of these boxes had spilled out onto the ground. But even more bizarrely, it looked like it wasn't totally haphazard. it looked like someone had intentionally kind of sifted through the boxes and taken out random objects and put them into strange piles that didn't make any sense. The objects were not alike. Or they had taken the objects and kind of stood them up in these strange arrangements, almost like they were being laid out for a garage sale. And so Brittany immediately just turns around and she leaves the garage. She goes to the other side of the house and she gets her husband. She brings James back and he looks inside. He's just as shocked as she is. And the two of them immediately just go into the garage and begin looking through all of the stuff to see if anything is missing. Now, it was pretty difficult to tell if something had been stolen, but they did have some valuable stuff that was in those boxes that had been pulled out and was lying on the ground, and that wasn't missing. And so that was a pretty good indication to James and Brittany that this wasn't a robbery. And so the only other thing they could think of would be that their two young sons must have come in here and been goofing around and pulled the boxes over, and so this is their doing. But when the parents confronted the two young sons, they said they didn't do it. Brittany believed them, but James didn't necessarily. He thought they could be lying about it, and if they were telling the truth, then, maybe one of their pets had gotten into the garage and caused all this chaos. They had purchased a dog when they got to Hawaii, so they had a cat and a dog. And so James was just being very dismissive of this whole garage incident and not taking seriously the fact that Brittany was really spooked by this. But regardless of how the family members felt about the garage incident, they all just kind of moved on because there really wasn't anything to do except pick the garage up and continue on. About a week after the garage incident, Brittany was home alone one morning getting ready. She was sitting in the master bedroom in front of her mirror and she was applying eyeliner and she had a YouTube video playing some makeup tutorials. And as she's applying the makeup, she suddenly hears the front door downstairs slam shut. She almost pokes her eye out with her eyeliner. She's so startled by the sound of it. And she immediately pauses her YouTube video and she calls out for James and her sons, believing they must be home and somebody slammed the door. But when she calls out, she gets no response. Now, immediately, Brittany is going through all of these different rationalizations like, okay, maybe James and the boys opened the door, they got something or put something in the house, they slammed it and they left. And so that's why they didn't hear me call their name. But she couldn't help but feel like something was wrong. She's also thinking about the garage incident, which really never left her. She pretended like she had moved on, but really she hadn't. And so she stands up and she begins walking towards the open door that led out into the hallway. And then from the master bedroom, if you were looking out into the second floor hallway, it basically went straight across to another door. That was her son's bedroom. And in between these two doors, basically halfway down the second floor hallway, to the left was a flight of stairs that went straight down to the first floor. And when you reached the bottom of those steps, right in front of you would be the front door, the door that had slammed. And so Brittany reaches the threshold of the master bedroom. She's looking out into the second floor hallway. She doesn't see anyone. And so she yells out again for James and for her sons, but again, there's silence. So she takes a deep breath and she begins walking down the second floor hallway and she makes it halfway. She turns left and she gets onto the stairs. And as she's walking down these steps, the house is eerily quiet and she's got this growing sense of dread inside of her and she's kind of quietly calling out for James and her sons, but it's totally quiet. And she gets to the foot of the stairs. She kind of scans around her. She doesn't see anyone. And then she walks to the front door. She flings it open, expecting, hoping to see James's car in the driveway or just see some indication that her husband or her sons had been there or were there. But when she opened that door, James's car was not there. There was no sign of anybody in the area. It was just her. And so with her heart racing, she shut the door, she locked it, and then she walked all around the first floor, checking every window, checking every door, making sure everything was locked. She went upstairs, she did the same thing, checking every room, every closet. There was no one in the house with her, she was sure of it. And so she went back to her room, thinking to herself, what do I make of that? How do I reconcile the fact that I clearly heard the front door slam, but no one's here? And so Brittany would eventually leave the house and go about her day. And then that evening, she would come back home and her husband and her sons would be there. And at some point, she would bring up the slamming door to her husband to get a sense of, could that have been him? And he would tell her that no, he had not come by the house that day, so that could not have been him. But he assured his wife, don't worry, you probably just unlocked the door and a draft came through and slammed the door. You got nothing to worry about. But Brittany would tell her husband that that was just not possible, that she always shut the door. She always shut and locked the door. So the idea that she had forgotten to lock it and had left it partially ajar enough to the point that a draft could slam it the way it did, it just didn't make any sense. But just like the garage incident, James was very dismissive and just told his wife, "You're being super paranoid. You have nothing to worry about. It's just a door. Don't worry about it." But this really upset Brittany, and she got mad at James, and before long the two were just totally fighting about it, and by the time they actually laid their heads down on their pillows that night, they weren't even speaking. And so the couple that night, they fall asleep angrily, and then in the middle of the night, Brittany wakes up suddenly. She doesn't know why she's woken up, but she's kind of looking around the room. It's totally silent, and she's trying to get her bearings. And as she's sitting there, she hears downstairs, not a slamming door, but the sound of a door opening and then shutting. Immediately, she is on heightened alert. And instead of doing anything, she just kind of leans forward and listens really intently to make sure she really heard what she thought she just heard. And as she's sitting there listening, she can hear again another door downstairs, a different door, opening and then shutting. And at this point, she begins to panic. She reaches over, she shakes James awake, and she tells him, "I can hear someone opening and shutting doors downstairs." Now, James was not remotely thrilled to be having this conversation. He was still mad at his wife for being so paranoid about the door earlier, and so to be woken up in the middle of the night to his wife freaking out about more doors being open and shut, he was just really upset. And so he sits up, he's totally annoyed, and he's not ready to really take seriously anything Brittany is saying, and Brittany's picking up on this, and so finally she just says, "James, did you lock the front door before you went to bed?" And so James is like, "Yes, I locked the front door. I'm telling you, you're hearing things. There's nothing going on in this house." But Brittany was not convinced, and she says, "You know what? You can think nothing's going on, but I'm going downstairs to make sure no one is in this house." And so Brittany would get out of her bed, she'd walk over to the open door that led into the second floor hallway, and as soon as she looked out, she didn't see anything, she didn't hear anything, and so very slowly she began walking down the second floor hallway until she reached the top of the stairs. And at that point, she turned and looked downstairs into the pitch black first floor. She was terrified, but she knew she had to go down there to make sure her family was safe. And so down the stairs she went, and when she got to the bottom of the stairs, she saw right away the front door was unlocked. Brittany's thinking, why would my husband tell me he locked the door if it's not locked? And so then Brittany's thinking, okay, my sons must have gotten out of bed and they must have unlocked the door. That's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing these doors opening and shutting because my sons are down here somewhere and they're the ones causing all this noise. And so Brittany kind of felt relieved for a second because this seemed like what must be going on. But after locking the front door and then searching the whole first floor, she didn't find her sons. And then when she went upstairs again and went into her boys' room, she found both of them were fast asleep in their beds. And when she shook them awake, they showed no sign of having been awake recently. They were totally groggy and could not have been running around the house just minutes earlier. And so now Brittany is terrified. She tucks her boys back in and she tells them, everything is fine. But then she hustles back over to the master bedroom with her husband and she tells James the front door was unlocked and our sons were fast asleep. It couldn't have been them. But James continues to be very dismissive, telling his wife, "You are totally overreacting, you're being paranoid, you're just hearing the sound of those doors because you're scared. There isn't any doors slamming in the house." And as he's saying this, their back sliding door downstairs that led to their backyard suddenly slammed open and then slammed shut. And as soon as this happened, James, who had been so dismissive and totally skeptical, he instantly changed and he looked at his wife and he said, "You stay right here." And he jumped out of his bed and he ran out of the bedroom. A few minutes later, he would come back into the master bedroom and he would tell his wife that, the back door, it was unlocked, but it was shut. I'm sure you just forgot to lock it. And the same draft that is opening and shutting doors, probably opened and shut the back door too. So we got nothing to worry about. The house is locked right now. Let's just get in bed and go to sleep. And at this, Brittany is incredulous, and she says to her husband, "You gotta be kidding me. There is something weird happening in our house. Doors are opening and shutting. We had that thing with the garage. You can't act like nothing is happening." And this, in turn, turned into a big fight. And so before long, the parents weren't even talking about who opened and shut the doors downstairs. They were just fighting with each other. And then eventually, they were just so tired that they gave up and they both went to sleep. For the next few weeks, nothing happened inside of the house. Brittany, though, continued to obsess over who or what had been causing those doors to open and shut, and then also, what happened in the garage, what caused all that stuff to fall out and wind up in these strange arrangements. Meanwhile, James continued to be unbelievably dismissive and did not want to talk about the potential for something strange happening in their house. But something strange would happen to just James without Brittany around, and that would be the first time that he would get really spooked. It was a couple of weeks after the nighttime door slamming incident, and James, he was alone at his house. It's the middle of the day, and he decided he would just play the piano. And so he moved to his piano in the living room, which is on the first floor. He sat down and he began playing. And then after a little while, he started to feel like he was being watched. And it got to the point where it was so uncomfortable, he had to stop playing and actually look around and make sure he really was alone. And when he did that, he noticed out the window to his right, which led into the side yard, that there was clearly a figure standing in the window outside looking in with its arms down. But there was a curtain over the window, and so all he could see was this shadow figure standing at the window. And so James is immediately startled, and as soon as he reacted to this figure, the figure suddenly starts moving towards the back of the house. And so James, he gets up and he rushes over to another window that looked into the backyard, and he looks outside, and there's no one there. And then he goes back to the window he originally saw the figure in, he opens it up, there's no one there. And so James would ultimately tell himself that, okay, that must have just been some nosy neighbor that heard the music, they came over, and they noticed that maybe I saw them and they ran off before I could see them. And so that's what it was. But deep down, what he saw in the window really shook him up. However, it would be the blanket incident that would finally push James to go from being dismissive and skeptical to admitting to his wife, we got a problem. It was not long after James spotted that dark figure outside of the window when he and his wife and his 2 kids decided they would head out to a movie theater to catch a movie. And so as they're getting ready to go, Brittany would say that she wanted to bring along a particular blanket that the whole family loved to use when they were sitting on the couch. She was going to bring that blanket with her to the movie theater to kind of cuddle up under for the movie. And so she would make her way into the living room and she would see the blanket was missing. It was not on the couch where it normally was. And so she would ask her husband and her sons if they had any idea where it was, and they would say, no, we haven't touched it. She would look all over the place, under the couch, in the living room. She went upstairs. She couldn't find it. And so finally they just left without the blanket. But when they came back that evening, there on the couch, folded up neatly, was this blanket. Everybody knew that blanket had not been there when they left. So how did it get there? For the next few weeks, the parents did their best to put on a brave face and tell their kids that everything was okay. But the parents and the kids were all terrified to be in that house. And that's because, at night, the doors continued to open and shut. Their dog periodically would just start barking in the middle of the night for no apparent reason, and they would all get this awful sense that they were being watched all the time in their house. And so finally, by September of that year, the parents decided, we just have to get out of this house. We cannot be here. We need to take a break. And so they packed up their stuff and they flew to mainland America, where they stayed with some family for a week. On September 20th, they hopped back on a plane and they flew back to Honolulu. And as they're driving from the airport to their house, Brittany and James were just kind of secretly hoping that, whatever weirdness was happening in their house would just magically stop once they returned. But as soon as James turned onto their street and they could see their house, they knew that was not going to be the case. Because as they began driving up their road, they could see James's very nice road bike was laying on their driveway. And so Brittany, she turned to her husband, and even though she knew the answer, she said, James, were you riding your bike before we left? And James, who doesn't even look at his wife, just shakes his head. No, he wasn't. And so James drives all the way down the road. He turns into their driveway, which is lined up right with the front of the garage door. And after James parks the car, he hits the garage door opener button. And so as James is sitting in the driver's seat, Brittany's right next to him, the kids are in back, they're watching as this door is raising right in front of them. And as soon as they can see into the garage, they see everything in their garage has just been completely trashed. Things are not just dumped out, but things have been ripped apart and shredded as if a wild animal had been let loose inside of the garage. James immediately said to his wife, "We've been robbed." And then he hopped out of the car and then turned and told his kids, "You stay in the car, do not get out." And James, he went over to the side of the house and got a sledgehammer for protection and made his way to the front door. Meanwhile, Brittany would be on the phone with 911 to report that someone had broken into their house. A few minutes later, James was inside of his house and he saw the entirety of his house was just like the garage. It had been completely ripped to shreds. But amidst the chaos were those kind of strange piles of random objects, much like they had seen in that first garage incident where the things inside of the boxes had been stacked in kind of strange piles and arrangements. And so James is looking around his first floor and he's seeing stacks of coasters and books and electronics. But what really got James's attention was that on various surfaces, there were these medical vials of drugs or chemicals that were placed all over the place. And he knew that was not his family's. Someone had brought those vials into this house. James would make his way up the stairs to the second floor landing, and right away he could tell, the upstairs had all the hallmarks of being destroyed as much as the first floor. But when he went left and went into his boys' room, he saw that room was pristine. In fact, it had been cleaned. The boys' laundry was neatly folded on one side of the room, their beds were perfectly made with military precision, and all of their toys and different things that were normally all over the floor were neatly put away in the places they should go. And so James would turn around and leave his boys' room in absolute astonishment, and he would walk across the second floor hallway into the master bedroom. And what he would find in there would make an already terrible situation much, much worse. The master bedroom was destroyed like the majority of the house and garage, except the top of their bed was not covered in junk. Instead, on their bed was this towel that had been neatly laid out, almost like a tablecloth. And laying on this towel, neatly spaced apart, kind of perfectly arranged, were a bunch of knives. And then next to the knives, still on the towel, was a laptop that the Campbell family owned, but they didn't use it. It did work, but it just kind of sat in the master bedroom. And this laptop was sitting on this towel, and it was open, but the screen had turned off. And so by this point, Brittany had come upstairs. And so Brittany and James, they walk over in horror to this layout on their bed, and they click the keys on the keyboard of their laptop, and it illuminates the screen and shows whatever was being worked on last. And it's this long, long Word document that neither of them made. They scrolled to the top of this document, and the document was titled The Omnivore Trials, and then below that it said, A Rehabilitation for Rat-like People. And then below that, the entire document was kind of like a diary. It was a whole bunch of observations about so-called specimens. And these specimens were very clearly the Campbell family. And these observations made about the Campbell family were very intimate. In fact, the only way to garner these observations were if you were watching the Campbell family right up close, almost on an hourly basis for days, weeks, months at a time. These observations ranged from what time the Campbell family liked to watch TV to what James and Brittany talked about behind closed doors in their bedroom, including their struggle to have a child, something they were not talking about to their family. But in this document, the author of the Omnivore Trials would talk about how the creature, which was referencing Brittany, needed to stop trying to have another baby and instead focus on the children she already had. Toward the end of this really lengthy document, the author of the Omnivore Trials came to a shocking conclusion that in order to rehabilitate these rat-like people, the Campbells, the author would have to perform several surgeries on the specimens. These surgeries were hand amputations and gender reassignment surgeries. And then after this conclusion, there was another note that detailed all the different surgeon tools the author would need to perform these surgeries, as well as a list of drugs and chemicals they would need in order to sedate these specimens before they performed these surgeries. And so after James and Brittany see this, they realize that those knives laying out on the towel were for them. Those were the knives that were going to be used for the surgeries. And all those weird vials, those medical vials they saw all downstairs, those were likely the drugs that would be used to sedate them so they could go under the knife. 15 minutes before James and Brittany went into their house and discovered the knives, and the medical vials, and the laptop, James grabbed that sledgehammer and walked to the front door while his wife called 911. And so James, he gets to the front door, he puts his key into the lock, he unlocks it, and with the sledgehammer in one hand, he attempts to push the door open. But despite the door being unlocked, he can't open it. There's resistance behind the door. And so James kind of gets down and he presses as hard as he can into the door with his shoulder until finally it opens up just a crack and James can see into the house. And so James, as he's pressing the door barely open, he's staring into this crack, trying to make out what's going on inside of his house. And then suddenly a set of eyes meet his from behind the door. And before James can do anything, this man that is standing inside of his house says to James,
This is not your house.
and then proceeds to push the door shut on James. James, in an adrenaline-fueled fury, smashed the door open, grabbed this guy, and yanked him out of the house and threw him onto the front yard. And then James, with his sledgehammer, would stand in front of this guy between him and his kids and his wife, and he would say, if you go anywhere, I'm going to have to attack you with this. But the intruder, this guy, whose name was Ezekiel Zayas, he was a 23-year-old young man, he would just stand on the Campbell's property, staring directly at James, unblinking. And then, a couple of minutes later, the police would show up, and Ezekiel would not put up any fight, he would be arrested, and he would be taken away. It was after he was gone that James and his wife would actually go into their house, and they would see the state it was in, and they would go upstairs, and they would discover the knives and the laptop. It would turn out, months earlier, Ezekiel had apparently found a way to sneak in and out of the Campbell's property. And so around the time they had moved in, Ezekiel was living there as well. He was mostly living in the crawl space above the second floor bathroom, and then whenever he was able to, Ezekiel would climb down out of this crawl space and he would go and observe the Campbells. And this was not just at night. Based on some of the observations inside of Ezekiel's omnivore trials document, clearly he was watching the family in the middle of the day too. Also, based on these observations in this document, it was pretty clear that Ezekiel was getting ready to actually carry out these surgeries on the Campbell family, meaning the Campbells' decision to go on vacation when they did could very well have saved their lives. And if there was any question as to whether Ezekiel could have actually carried out that level of physical harm on another human being by carrying out those surgeries, well, after he was arrested for what he did to the Campbells, while he was in jail, he beat his cellmate to death, allegedly. Although a guard literally walked in and saw Ezekiel punching and kicking and beating this guy, and then he died. But technically the trial is not over, so it's allegedly. Ezekiel is currently in a state hospital, and they are trying to determine if he is fit to stand trial for what he did to the Campbells and for what he did to his cellmate. Even though it might be self-explanatory at this point in the video, it's worth pointing out that we have no idea what Ezekiel's motives were for why he did the things he did to the Campbell family or what he was looking to achieve with the so-called omnivore trials. We also don't know why he allegedly killed his cellmate. As for the Campbells, this whole experience was so traumatic that they did not stay at their Hawaii house. They moved, and as of today, their whereabouts are unknown. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, when the Amazon Music follow button calls your restaurant to place a very long and complicated order for delivery, wait until they're totally finished before telling them their house is out of your delivery range. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as the victims' families.